In the United States, there are so-called core classes that are required for students to take from kindergarten through 12th grade, let's say. So for example, these classes might be reading, writing, arithmetic, etc. But what would it look like if the domain were actually to go from a required class to not being required? At what point would that happen, and when would those educators argue for that? By asking questions like, should there be less mathematics education? That question right there is actually the title of a paper we're unpacking, and it is by Shah. Apologies if I mispronounced your name. And I'm going to talk about how this relates to computer science education. So posing the question, should there be less computer science education? If you're new to this podcast, my name is Jared O'Leary, and I am the host of the CSK8 podcast and have a variety of experiences working with all grades, kindergarten through doctoral, in music education, computer science education, and other contexts. Here's the abstract for today's short paper that we're going to talk about. Now, because this paper is talking about mathematics, I'm going to actually adjust the wording slightly. So instead of saying mathematics, I'm going to say computer science and computer science education, just to make it more relevant. Quote, computer science education is typically seen as intrinsically beneficial to individuals and to society. More broadly, access to STEM education is considered essential in a technology-driven modern economy, particularly for people from racially minoritized groups. In this article, I interrogate the underlying logic of these dominant narratives by asking, should there be less computer science education? I argue that although computer science and STEM education do have value, they come with significant current and future costs to society. Further, I question the net benefits they promise for people from racially minoritized groups. I conclude by provoking the field to consider what might be gained by having less computer science education and how that might better serve a vision of racial justice, end quote. If I were to summarize this publication into a single sentence, I would say that this publication questions at what point it would be beneficial for there to be less mathematics education requirements. And again, we're going to talk about this in relation to computer science education. So the author begins by saying that as a field, mathematics education, they talk about how we need to focus on quality of instruction, but very rarely do we actually talk about the quantity or how much mathematics should be taught. So this was not something that was always the case. This is something that has kind of been pushed for in the United States to be a graduation requirement. Like for myself, I had to have 4 years of mathematics instruction in 4 years of high school, and same thing with English language arts, in order to get into the university that I wanted to get into. However, I was fortunate that one of my classes could actually be a computer science class, which was a coding class. You did C++. It was the first time they ever offered it in our school. And so my junior year, I took 2 mathematics courses. So that way I could take 2 English classes my senior year, so I wouldn't have to take any in college, thanks to dual enrollment and whatnot. But what would somebody like me have done if I didn't have those requirements? Like if I only had to take 2 years of math in high school, or maybe 2 years of English? Or what about if instead of having number of years, it was, hey, once you get to a certain level of mathematics, then you don't need to take anymore. Anything after that is optional. Like let's say after algebra or after geometry, you could take whatever you want if you wanted to, or you could instead turn those into elective courses. So this paper is going to question that. This is a very short paper, so this will be a relatively short episode. But the first main section of this paper talks about, quote, the cost of mathematics education, end quote. And so the author points out that there are some costs both during K-12 or K-16 classes and afterwards. So the author mentions in this section that with No Child Left Behind, that was enacted in 2001, that mathematics was actually elevated in terms of requirements. But the author points out that more time in one subject area means less time in other subject areas, which is something that I've mentioned on many previous episodes. Although not the sole reason for this, this is one of the reasons why there have been cuts in other domains, like in music education or the arts or physical education, science, etc. And with the so-called learning loss that has gone on after the remote learning or lack of schooling during school closures and whatnot from the pandemic, I've anecdotally heard from many districts that administrators are more focused on reading, writing, arithmetic than they've ever been, because scores have dropped, even though the drop's only like 1% in most areas. So now we're going to cut all these other non-essential subjects, or decrease the amount of time that we spend on them. So the author poses the question of asking, but where are we going with all of this? How will this impact what's happening down the road? Quote, one day mathematics and STEM education will take us beyond the moon to the other reaches of the galaxy, but I worry about what we will bring with us. Could we end up with the McDonald's on Mars and racism on Jupiter? Mathematics educators may not want this future, but capitalism does not care what we want. Social studies or music education will not take us to other planets. This will be an ethical quagmire created by mathematics and STEM education, end quote. Now, the same questioning or logic can apply to computer science education. So yeah, there are many open jobs out there in the United States for computer scientists or software developers, etc. Even though in episode 176, titled The End of Programming, those jobs might not be around in a while, according to the author that we unpack in that episode. But another question that we need to ask is the only purpose of schooling to get a job? Now, I've done a couple of episodes that talk about leisure and its role in formal schooling and beyond. For example, check out episode 71, 1, which is titled Considering Leisure in Education with Roger Manti. But I've also done many episodes that talk about modding and mod culture, which is like being able to change a video game to make it do something different. So the example that I love to give is like people modded the game Skyrim so that instead of like a dragon, they changed it so that it was Thomas the Tank Engine. So you have this little like train flying around, breathing fire and whatnot. And it's hilarious. I love it for so many different reasons. But that style of modding can be done in leisure rather than to get a job in computer science or software development or whatever, even like the gaming industry. But these are my own arguments for making a case for, hey, instead of just focusing on jobs, if you're going to require this course for everyone, why don't we also focus on using CS for leisure? Because not everyone's going to go into a career in computer science. And that's great and all, but this author might encourage us to question, well, do we even need computer science to begin with? At what point is it enough? Which might lead to the next question or next section of this paper that might interest you, which is the question of, but can't more mathematics education lead to equity and justice? And so you might be thinking, well, Jared, I mean, computer science is like very fundamental to some of the ethical conundrums that we've run into with data being collected and misuse of apps and platforms, etc. And all this broadening participation has led to some good, hasn't it? Well, in last week's episode titled Racial Justice Amidst the Dangers of Computing Creep, a Dialogue, which is episode 177, raises some questions about that. In fact, it actually pointed to this article and made me go, I want to read that. So the author is arguing in this particular article that mathematics has been suggested as being helpful for equity and justice, specifically for minoritized groups. It's the same argument that is applied to computer science education, where it's like, hey, there's all these jobs, they make a lot of money doing this thing, having the skill set in math or in computer science, and if people in minoritized groups were to actually learn how to be able to do that, then it would help them economically. And as the authors point out in last week's episode, yes, this might be great for individuals, but what about for the groups? So while some minoritized individuals might make more money, the minoritized groups are still in the same predicament that they have been in. And just addressing socioeconomic issues does not address all the other issues like racism and the bro culture that is in the STEM or computer science fields that has been reported by many people who work in the industry. So last week cites some of the podcast episodes that kind of unpack, well, here are some problems that we still need to talk about. Like in episode 117, which is STEM Diversity and Inclusion Efforts for Women of Color, a critique of the new labor system, which talks about how this approach is kind of a new form of sharecropping. So while the author points out that there have been many approaches in mathematics education to try and get it so that everybody is able to take more math, like the Algebra for All movement, which is very similar for the CS for All movement. But the author points out that some white parents in particular have lobbied for, okay, well, if other minoritized groups are going to get the same education, then we're going to push to have calculus in 8th grade, which, yes, that is a citation for an actual thing. So anytime the playing field is being leveled, well, then they're going to try and find some other way to advance beyond that, which might not be inherently problematic. Like if you want your students to have an above average education, I mean, yeah, that makes sense. But we do need to talk about how it tends to be certain demographics that receive that above average education and not others. And we can raise the question of why is that? But the author goes on page 31 to say, quote, another problem is that while greater Black and brown participation in the STEM workforce may attenuate racial wealth gaps, it does not account for how STEM has been deployed to dehumanize people of color. And a little bit further down, quote, a more racially just world can't only be about economics. It must also be one where people of color are recognized as full human beings, end quote, which is an important point and is a very unfortunate thing that has to be stated. But given the history of the United States and, like the 3/5 compromise, it is one that must be made, which leads into a later argument that we'll talk about soon. But the author goes on to say that all these movements in mathematics education might help incrementally to reduce harm. However, it is not radical enough transformation, according to the author, which leads to this important quote on page 31. Quote, this may lead to more girls of color and more emergent multilingual students participating in mathematics classrooms, but it still ends up giving the students access to mathematics and the world as they are. The endpoints of their educational journeys have not fundamentally changed, end quote, which is so important. I mean, the same thing applies to computer science education. Yeah, we might get more people who are interested in computer science, but they're still going to go into a field that is historically hostile to them. For example, it is well known that in industry, many women report being treated poorly. Many people of color report being treated poorly. So without those issues being addressed, have we really improved anything? I know that's outside of the scope of K-12 educators. Like when I was in the classroom, had no impact on what a corporation would end up doing in terms of their HR policies and practices. So as educators, we might be able to help prepare them by saying, yo, this is what you need to expect. Like, how about you speak with some other people who have similar demographics, similar experiences and backgrounds as you, who are in industry, and kind of talk with them to figure out what to do to kind of prepare yourself for what's going on, and then maybe work from within to try and change that environment. But that's easier said than done. And again, that's also just kind of setting you up to learn how to tolerate abuse, which is not okay. But this leads into the final section of this short paper. So the final section is titled, "What is gained from less mathematics education?" So the author problematized how, more of this subject area hasn't really led to better equity and justice. But they next posed the question in this final section, what is gained from less mathematics education? So maybe instead of doing more of this, it hasn't really fundamentally changed equity issues and justice. Would it actually be better if we had less of it? So here's a really interesting question that they ask on page 31. Quote, "If we had less mathematics education, what could we do with that newly opened space in the curriculum?" End quote. So the author talks about how, perhaps we could talk about climate policy, healthcare, actually discuss ethics more, especially in the K-12 and K-16 realm, or focus on things that might have a more direct route to justice. Which, here's an interesting quote that the author mentions. Quote, "Seeding curricular space for more lessons and entire lessons squarely focuses on the issues would be a more direct route to justice through education. Lobbying for such curricula would be politically difficult, but a first step would be to open room for them," end quote. And snaps to that. So kudos to the author for making a statement like that. I mean, very few people would argue, hey, this thing that I really love, that I'm very passionate about, that has had a profoundly positive impact on my life, I think other students should have less of it. And here's the final quote from page 31. Quote, "It's simply not enough for each of us to focus on our individual silos of research or practice and be content with incremental change. I argue that the field of mathematics education should prioritize a goal of justice for minoritized groups and do so with urgency, even if it means there should be less mathematics education," end quote. And again, let's apply that to computer science education. I mean, what would it look like if instead of having one more class being crowbarred into the required classes, what if instead it was one less class? How would that impact things? Which leads into the lingering questions and thoughts that I like to pose at the end of these Unpacking Scholarship episodes. So one of them is, at what point will someone have enough CS experience in a K-12 context? Are we headed towards mathematics requirements? Is that what we want as a field? Do we want to make it so that every student, kindergarten through 12th grade, is required to engage in computer science throughout an entire course every single year? Some would argue yes, but again, as I've mentioned multiple times, if we're adding in more and more requirements, that's taking away less and less from other areas. If we're going to do all of them, then does that just mean we're going to dilute everything? Or are we going to remove stuff from our program? Like physical education is nearly non-existent in some of the state requirements. Same thing for arts education, etc. Are those things not important? Why or why not? When you have a gut reaction to a question like that, what do you immediately think of? No, it's important because of X. Or yes, it's important because of Y. Why do you focus on those areas? And should that be the only purpose of public education? Let's say students are required to participate in computer science through elementary school for several years. Like maybe they have required standards, etc. Do we need graduation requirements for middle or high schools? If it's all about trying to get kids early to help them see themselves as a computer scientist, wouldn't they have an understanding at that point whether they are interested in that career or not? Some might. Like I personally would have loved to just have music classes instead of having to take 2 math classes my junior year and 2 English classes my senior year. I did those for graduation requirements and entrance requirements to get into universities. But I would have much rather have spent it just like being able to practice or perform in ensembles, etc. I mean, if we focus on mathematics education, I can confidently say that I have very, very, very rarely used anything beyond basic algebra and geometry in my life and in my career. So in all the programming that I've done, I've maybe engaged in some physics and done some algebra there. I've maybe done a little bit of geometry here and there in life, but honestly, most of it has not been anything beyond what I learned in elementary school. And I'm saying that as somebody with a PhD who took quant classes, statistics, etc. Like, there's very little actual mathing involved on my end, as much as it is just plugging numbers into like a program and then it pumps out data for me. So if that's the case, like depending on what field you're in, why do we require a number of years to be in a mathematics education rather than just achieving a certain level? So in particular with mathematics, because there are different levels of math where like you have like maybe geometry and then it goes into algebra, then maybe into algebra 3-4, maybe into pre-calculus, calculus 3-4, etc. Why is it that with mathematics, it's not, hey, once you get to algebra, you can choose to do anything after that? Instead, it's no, you have to have 4 years. Even if you are more advanced than somebody else, like if there's a scale here, you're going to have 4 years either in the lower end, the middle end, or in the upper end. But regardless, you're going to have to do 4 years. So if you happen to excel at mathematics, cool, you have to do 4 years in more advanced mathematics. But if you do not excel at mathematics and you focus on other areas, cool, you still have to do 4 years. It's just going to be in less advanced math classes. As opposed to saying, hey, get to this certain level, and then after that level, you can do what you want with that. Personally, I'm very grateful that the high school that I went to counted computer programming as a math class. That made it so that I could take one last math class and instead do a computer science class. If I didn't have that option though, I would have had to have gotten rid of yet another elective to take this class that I wanted to do. And that to me is problematic. But another question that I have for anyone is, what other subject areas might we benefit from having more of? So for example, culinary arts. It saves money, you can be healthier, you can impress a significant other by whipping up a nice dish. What about physical education? Physical health is extremely important. I mean, if we want to go from a capitalistic standpoint, it's a lot cheaper to have healthier population than an unhealthier one. And the better your physical and mental health, the more productive you can be. And speaking of mental health, what about mental health classes? What about classes on nutrition or even relationships or investment classes and financial well-being classes? I mean, how many people went into absurd amounts of debt to become an educator only to realize, oh wow, that was a lot of money that I just spent. Maybe you would have done it differently. Maybe you would have gone to a different institution rather than the one that you went to. I don't know. What about communication classes? This could be both macro and micro. Like for example, communication classes like I'm doing right now to be able to podcast to large audience. Or what about just engaging in better civil online discourse and engaging in conversations with people you disagree with? Wouldn't that be beneficial as a society or as a world? What about more foreign language requirements? I wish I had a Japanese class when I was in school. Here I am struggling my way through it as an adult. And honestly, I would have benefited from more Spanish classes, especially living in Arizona. It has been so helpful to just be able to know the few words and sentences that I can piecemeal together. I wish I knew more. Now, to be clear, because you may have listened to some of the other episodes, I'm not arguing we should require more classes, but require less classes and allow people to choose the kinds of classes that they are more interested in. So we do this with like some magnet schools where it's like, hey, if you're really interested in, I don't know, STEM, cool, you can go to a STEM school where all of your electives are going to be STEM, all of your required classes are going to be STEM, or even for the arts. If you happen to have a magnet school near you that is related to things that you are for sure interested in, then that can work out great. But if you don't have that option, then what? You're stuck taking maybe 13 years of K-12 classes that you don't enjoy. I, myself, was debating dropping out of school. The only thing that kept me going was the music classes. I was so bored in class, not interested in anything that we were studying, anything that we were learning. I just wanted to make music. And I wouldn't have had that opportunity to be able to play in the ensembles that I wanted to if I had left school. So I stuck with it because of that. I've mentioned this a lot in the interest-driven learning episodes that I'll link to in the show notes. But if we focus on students' interests and give more options rather than less, it gives the students the autonomy to explore what they're interested in and actually kindle a passion for learning, as opposed to being force-fed education requirements from well-being and well-intentioned others. So even though computer science education or even mathematics education may have worked really well for you, if you are in the field of computer science education, odds are you enjoy it. So if you had less requirements of other subject areas where you could spend more time working on computer science and computer science education, would you have enjoyed that? My guess is yes. But what about if that's flipped? What about for the students who don't enjoy computer science, who have given it a fair shot and they're like, you know what? This is not for me. It's neat, it's interesting, cool, thank you, I appreciate it. I want to spend more time doing this other thing. Is that wrong? How can we allow both to happen? For me, the answer is less requirements in general, which is my answer to the question that is the title of this episode. Should there be less computer science education? I would say yes, but there should be less of all required classes. But that's just my opinion. You're more than welcome to come on this podcast and argue with me in a respectful way. There's no need to be rude. And you can even leave in your comments on YouTube. I do read all of them and try to respond to all of them, so feel free to reach out if you agree, disagree, etc. I'll include links in the show notes to other episodes in case you're listening to this out of context and you haven't heard me talk about some of these other areas. But there's 170 some odd episodes in this podcast, so there's a ton of content in there, and I've talked about this ad nauseum. So if I left something out and it doesn't make sense to you, my apologies. I can clarify in an upcoming episode if you have a question. But thank you so much for listening to this. If you'd be so kind, consider sharing with somebody else or just leaving a review. It just helps more people find this content. And this is my job. Well, you know, and gaming and drumming, all that stuff. So I create a lot on my channel, on my website, but hopefully the playlists on my website just make it easy to organize it all. But I am sincerely appreciative of everybody who has listened and shared with others. Stay tuned next week for another episode. Until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.